Hey there guys, for today's From the Notebook, I'm going to do my first kind of musy talky post. And if you don't know why, then you should follow me on Twitter. A couple of weeks ago, Michaela posted a video review of Eon by Allison Goodman, which is, by the way, a book series that I have read. But in the middle of that review, she kind of started talking about some of the issues that she has with YA, and while we could fight about them all the livelong day, I wanted to specifically mention something that she talked about, which really struck home with me, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. But it was that, is YA only for girls? And is there a YA out there that's for boys? And how YA at the very least is skewed towards girls. And I think that that's a really, really weird and important thing to talk about. And so I mentioned on Twitter that I want to do a response to that video, and here we are a little while later doing that response. So get ready. The reason why this is so important to me is that me and my brother Dieter, we're 2 years apart, and he's the other really big reader in my family, but it wasn't always that way. He had a really, really hard time getting into reading and getting into learning to read, and I really would like to say that I helped him along with that process. He had this really crazy phonics online program called Headsprout that got him into reading, and then he found the Magic Treehouse books and he read those, but reading to him wasn't something that excited him the way that it excited me, and I wanted him to have that experience because I taught myself to read when I was 3 because I made my dad read me the same books over and over and over and over again, and so reading has always been a really big part of my life. So when I was about 12 years old, and that would have made him 10, we were introduced to Aragon by Christopher Paolini, and this was the book that for my brother did it. He read that and all of a sudden he just went, oh my god, reading is amazing, and now it's me and him running for the bookstore, and he still is that way, and I'm really, really happy about that. However, Aragon, if you've never read it, okay, it's not the most fabulously written book. It's not. I understand that. And the problem is that it's kind of this weird line between sort of YA, sort of high fantasy. I think it's trying to be high fantasy and ends up more YA, but either way, it's not technically a YA book, it's not technically a high fantasy book, but it's more high fantasy-esque, and that's what my brother really got connected to, was the high fantasy. But when he started reading, I wanted to read with him. I mean, we did kind of the Harry Potter thing, but I wanted us to be reading the same books and talking about the same books because I really loved that we got to do that with the Aragon series. So I kept trying to offer him some of the books that I was reading, and it was really, really hard to find a YA series that I could give to him. And one of them, for instance, was Tamora Pierce's Immortals series. This is the series set in Tortal with Dane as the main character, and she's a wild mage, so she talks to animals. And Dieter was not really high into reading these books, but he read them because of the animal magic. He was there for the animals, but the fact that there was a female protagonist kind of put him off, and then it's also one of the ones with the least amount of romance. Not that Tamora Pierce has a lot of romance, but he really didn't want to read that either. So I got him with those, and that was something we got to talk about. I did get him to read the Mortal Instruments series by Cassandra Clare, the first 3 books. He didn't read the rest of them because for him they got too romancy. But he did think that they were fun, and we talked about them because he really liked the character of Jace. So I was like, okay, I know what I'm trying to do here, and he needs less romance and more male characters. It just seemed like every book that I went to pick up had one of those covers that would immediately put a guy off, and then you're reading it, and I just couldn't find guy YA. And I understand that there is some of it out there, but I mean, if you go and you look at a window or a bookshelf of YA, there's nothing there for boys. And even if the books are there they would enjoy, like my brother definitely enjoyed the Wild Mage series and the Mortal Instruments series, I mean, just think about a shelf. There's no books there that I could give to my brother and say, here, read this. And he would be like, okay, this doesn't creep me out. It would be like, you know, giving people a romance novel to read in a classroom. They're not books that he'd be interested in picking up. I think the last book series that I got him to read with me was the Insignia series by S.J. Kincaid, because A, male protagonist, and B, there was a cover on it that was like more of a symbol cover, and so it wasn't like freaking him out. Thinking about the way that YA looks was especially prevalent to me because Michaela was reviewing the Eon series. The Eon series, when I first picked it up, had symbol covers on it. So no, you know, human form on the cover, just like dragon symbols and, you know, Asian-inspired mythology, dragon kind of thing. I was actually able to share that with my brother as well, and he read them. Wasn't exactly thrilled by them, but, you know, whatever, I wasn't either. And then when I was trying to get another male friend into reading YA, I was like, hey, you should read these, and I sent off my copy, and they were willing to do that. But the Eon books have just been repackaged to have a female form on the cover of those books. And that is really, really odd to me. I've seen books go from female figures on the cover to symbol, not as many symbol to female figures. And it just seemed to me like they were literally trying to rebrand them to be girls' books, when before I think that they did have something to offer to boys and girls. And again, I mean, we're even just saying boys and girls. It's a gender binary thing that shouldn't exist, but for the context of this conversation, I have to, you know, use the binary terms because that's this conversation in terms of, you know, media. So I understand that I'm using problematic terms, but here we are. Until the world gets a new vocabulary, I don't know how else to express what I'm trying to talk about. So back to Michaela's question. Is YA only for girls? And I don't think that it is in practice. I don't think that it should be. But I think that in reality, it is, and that's what it looks like at least, because boys aren't going to go to that section. I think that half of them would feel like they caught cooties just by walking by those shelves. There's so much emphasis on romance and the flowery covers and the pretty covers and the girls in the covers, and it's just like, it's not something that they're going to want to even browse through. And I know that there are really, really good, you know, books for boys about boys in YA, but they're few and far between, and boys aren't going to want to go searching for them. But then you have to ask, why isn't there YA literature for boys? Because there's children's books for boys, there's middle grade books for boys, and there are adult books for boys. And I've heard two different ways to explain this discrepancy, and both of them make sense, but both of them don't address the whole issue. And so the first one is that after middle grade, boys are not encouraged to read anymore. And so there isn't YA literature because there isn't a demand for YA literature for boys, because they're told to stop reading and to play sports and to be active. So there's no literature there because boys are being told they shouldn't read, so they don't read. And, you know, if you read as a boy reading YA, then that's weird. And Bruce Coville, who was the keynote speaker at a fantasy and science fiction conference here a couple of years ago called Pippi to Ripley, which I helped organize, had a really wonderful keynote about how we need to bring boys back into reading because they're not being encouraged to do that in school. Reading has somehow become a girl's thing or a nerd thing, and it's not encouraged if you're a manly man, which is ridiculous. And I do believe that's happening. I believe that that is a problem, and I believe that is a problem that needs to be addressed very, very, like, swiftly, strongly, and urgently. However, I also think that it's not the whole story, because on the flip side, you have people that say that there's no YA literature for boys, men, because men, boys, whatever, skip right to adult fiction. And especially if you go look at, you know, the fantasy and science fiction section in a bookstore, there is a lot more gender option, I guess, in fantasy and sci-fi, and a lot of it is slanted towards a male audience. And again, there wouldn't be a supply if there wasn't a demand. So obviously there are enough men readers, people interested in male protagonists, that read those books, that it's at least like kind of a 50-50 split, if not honestly slanted towards male readers. And I mean, whenever my dad goes into a bookstore, we have to always like comb through every single book on the fantasy and sci-fi section shelf, because my dad wants a new book and he is so indecisive. So I literally spend like a good 2 hours perusing all those books, and it really strikes me that there are more books that he or my brother might be willing to pick up rather than me. And not just because I like reading YA and I don't like reading like high fantasy or hard sci-fi, but just because there are more stories that would apply to them than to me. I'm not interested in those stories, you know, warfare, warriors, male and macho men stories exist in adult fantasy and sci-fi literature, but not in YA. It's conspicuously absent in YA, which is just so weird. So that's what I mean. There are these two narratives that say one is that boys stop reading and one is that boys skip reading YA. And both stories are true, but neither of them explain why there's so little like male literature in YA. And again, male literature doesn't even have to mean that it's like slanted towards boys, like just a male protagonist. And those books that rewrite books like, you know, Edward's story, and I think Wendy Higgins just came out with, you know, Caden's story from the Sweet Evil series, those don't count. That's not what I mean. It's very odd. Because I wouldn't mind, like I don't read primarily girl stories because I want to read about a female protagonist. They just are there, and it's easy for me I have the privilege of being able to pick off books off the shelf that are white females and that look like me and stuff like that. There aren't even any white dudes. Or there's like this many. One slightly positive trend that I have noticed, and maybe widening the YA range, maybe out of the female gender, is book covers going back to more of a symbol, which means that boys might be more likely to pick up a book if there isn't, you know, a girl in a dress on it. Makes sense. But also these books like Legacy of Kings, Six of Crows, these books that have a wide cast of characters that are main characters switching POV, and they're, you know, half girls and half guys. And so again, symbol covers on all those books, and then characters for everyone. And I don't know if the trying to appeal to everyone thing is actually going to work. I do think that we definitely need more single male narrator POVs, but that is at least a step in the right direction, I think, in terms of books that I might read that I could then, you know, give to my brother. Because for me, that's what this always comes back to. I look at books on shelves and I'm always in the back of my mind, of course I'm looking for me, but I'm looking for books that I can share with my family, and I only have brothers. So, that's so important to me. And it's one of those things that people, if you watch the videos to Bibliomancy for Beginners, especially when we either do YA books or talk about YA books, everybody always is like, oh, Gretchen, you like YA, and I have to stand there and defend it. But so this is one of those things, these weaknesses that I'm willing to admit about YA, because we have to fix it. It's not fair, and I know that there are readers who would want to read these books, even if it is only because their older sister wants to read the book and give it to them and say, hey, let's read this book together so we can talk about it and be excited about it together. And again, I recognize male, female, like we're using very simplistic binary terms here, and there should be so much more range in protagonists in general, all over all the spectrums that we are given in this life, you know, race, gender, sexuality. But this is the bone to pick that I have right now. And considering that usually we privilege the male point of view in every other space, it's just interesting that with YA, it's not. And that's sad to say, but this topic makes me so angry. I don't want boys to be told that they shouldn't read. I don't want boys who want to read have nothing to read that interests them, and therefore they stop reading because they're not interested. I don't want boys to think that because they get to graduate directly to adult fiction that there's something bad about YA, that devalues YA, because YA is important and YA can speak to people at a time in their lives when they need to be spoken to by people who know what they're feeling, or at least, you know, characters they think or can do that for them and share their pain and their stories. And boys have just as many of those as girls do, and the fact that we aren't representing them is a loss. And there's a generation of readers, I think, who are being lost and continue to be lost every day because YA looks like a Vogue magazine spread with all the girls in dresses and all the romance, and it needs to change. And I hope that advent of more of these books with a spread of characters means change, but I don't know. I'm just a girl who wants to be able to share her love of YA books with her brother. I'd like to be able to do that more often, and I can't. Thank you for sitting here and listening to my very long and impassioned rant. I didn't touch on half of the things that I wanted to touch on, but if you are into continuing this conversation with me, or, you know, so giving your own views on the subject, please comment down below, either on the YouTube channel or on my blog. Best way to contact me is the blog, but if you do it on the YouTube channel, Michaela is awesome and she will tell me that you said hi. So say hi.